I shoved the door open with more force than I intended, the bells above it jingling violently as I stepped into the cafe. My pulse thudded in my ears, a steady, pounding rhythm that drowned out the soft murmur of voices inside. I scanned the room, hoping, no, praying, I was wrong. That this whole thing was some ridiculous misunderstanding. And then I saw them. Brianna sat at a small, candlelit table near the back, her face glowing under the dim lights. Across from her, leaning in far too close, was him, the poet, David. His hand rested casually on the table, just inches from hers, fingers twitching like they were ready to make contact. They hadn't noticed me yet. I stood frozen, just a few steps from the door, my mind reeling. Brianna's smile, the one I used to think was only for me, was now aimed at him. She laughed at something he said, her head tilting back in a way that exposed the curve of her neck, that same curve I'd kissed 1,000 times. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of betrayal hit me like a freight train, and my body responded with a wave of nausea that I barely managed to suppress. The idyllic scene in front of me, the cozy cafe, the soft flicker of candles, the gentle hum of conversation, felt like a cruel joke. This was supposed to be our time, our long-awaited honeymoon. And yet here she was, laughing with another man, her eyes sparkling with a kind of happiness I hadn't seen in months. David leaned in closer, whispering something in her ear. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved on their own, propelling me toward the table. The closer I got, the clearer the picture became. The way her hand rested so casually next to his, the way her eyes flickered with a secret she was keeping from me. I stopped just behind Brianna's chair. For a moment, neither of them noticed me, too wrapped up in each other. Then David looked up, his smile faltering as he saw me standing there, fists clenched, breathing heavily. Brianna followed his gaze and turned around, her face going pale as she met my eyes. "Jason?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. My gaze flicked between them, the reality of what was happening sinking deeper into my bones. Brianna's eyes widened with guilt, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an explanation that wouldn't come. What the hell is going on here? My voice was low, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. David stood up, his expression morphing from surprise to discomfort. "Look, man, I think there's been a..." "Shut up." I cut him off, not caring for whatever excuse he was about to offer. I turned back to Brianna, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would explain why she was sitting here with him, why she looked so damn happy in his presence. But she didn't. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. I could feel the stares of the other patrons, their curiosity piqued by the tension that now filled the room. But I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the truth. And I wasn't leaving without it. 2 weeks earlier, if you'd told me I'd be storming into a cafe, accusing my wife of infidelity, I would have laughed in your face. Brianna and I were finally on our long-awaited honeymoon in this quiet, picturesque seaside town. We'd been planning it for months, saving up, dreaming about it. Life had been chaotic, work, family, the usual, but this was supposed to be our escape. Our first day here felt like stepping into a dream. The town was straight out of a postcard, quaint little streets lined with pastel-colored houses. Waves gently lapping against the shore, the smell of saltwater and fresh seafood wafting through the air. We spent the first few days walking hand in hand along the beach, eating in cozy restaurants where the waiters knew everyone by name, and watching the sun sink below the horizon, casting a golden glow over everything. Brianna seemed happy, or at least, I thought she was. Looking back, there were signs, small ones, but they were there. She'd always loved poetry, and when she found out about the local literary event, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. "I'd love to go," she said, holding up a flyer she'd found in the hotel lobby. "They're having a reading tonight, with some local poet. His work is supposed to be amazing." I'd been less enthused. Poetry wasn't really my thing. But I wanted her to enjoy herself, so I didn't protest when she said she'd go alone. "You sure you don't want to come?" she asked, already knowing the answer. I'd shrugged, kissing her on the forehead. "Nah, you go ahead. I'll probably just hit the bar and watch the game." She smiled, looking almost relieved. I chalked it up to her excitement for the event, not realizing that it might have been something more. That night, when she came back to the hotel, she was buzzing with excitement. She talked about the event non-stop, about the atmosphere, the people, and of course, the poet, David. She described him as incredibly talented and captivating. I noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she said his name. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just admiration for his work. Over the next few days, she started going to more of these events. She'd say she was just popping out for a quick reading or a coffee at one of the local literary cafes, and I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just soaking up the culture, enjoying herself. And why wouldn't she? We were on vacation, after all. But then she started coming back later and later. Some nights, she wouldn't get in until after midnight. Her face flushed, her words slightly slurred from too much wine. When I'd ask how the event went, she'd give vague answers, quickly changing the subject. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that she was just swept up in the charm of the town. But now, standing here, watching her sit with him, I realized I'd been a fool. As the days went on, the distance between Brianna and me only grew. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that it was just vacation stress, that we'd find our rhythm again soon. But something was different. She became more secretive, her phone always face down on the table or tucked into her bag, her conversations with me growing shorter and more distracted. When we'd walk along the beach, she'd lag behind, scrolling through messages or checking the time like she had somewhere else to be. I told myself I was overreacting. I'd never been the jealous type, and we'd been through rough patches before. But this felt different. There was an edge to her that hadn't been there before, a sense that her mind was always elsewhere. With someone else. I tried to talk to her, to figure out what was going on, but every time I brought it up, she'd brush me off. "It's nothing," she'd say with a laugh, leaning in to kiss me. "You're being paranoid." And for a while, I believed her. After that night in the cafe, the world around me felt muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on everything but the endless replay of what I'd seen. The days that followed were a blur, marked by a growing pit in my stomach and Brianna's increasingly distant behavior. I didn't confront her right away. Part of me still wanted to believe it was all in my head. But the image of her and David, their intimate exchange, haunted me. The next day, Brianna acted as if nothing had happened. She woke up early, like she always did, showered, and dressed before heading down to the hotel cafe for breakfast. Her smile was bright, her voice cheery, almost forced, as she talked about how she wanted to explore more of the town. She suggested visiting a local art gallery that afternoon. I went along with it, forcing myself to smile, pretending everything was fine. But every word she spoke felt like another stone added to the weight on my chest. I needed to know the truth. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Brianna wasn't just attending these literary events for the poetry. There was something more, something she wasn't telling me. My mind raced through every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. Was she meeting David outside the events? Had they already crossed a line I couldn't forgive? The questions piled up, and I found myself unable to sit still, unable to let go of the nagging doubt that gnawed at me. I decided to make a plan. Brianna mentioned another poetry reading that night, another chance for her to see David. She was casual about it, her words laced with a kind of careless excitement. She even invited me to come, but there was a flicker in her eyes that made me suspect she didn't really want me there. "I'm good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You go enjoy yourself. I might just have a quiet night in." Her face relaxed, her relief almost palpable. "All right, but let me know if you change your mind." I nodded, pretending to be absorbed in my phone as she grabbed her purse and slipped out the door. The second she was gone, I stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. My heart pounded as I checked my watch. If I timed it right, I could show up without her knowing, catch them in the act if there was something to catch. My plan was simple. I'd head to the venue a little later, slip in unnoticed, and watch from a distance. I waited for what felt like an eternity, staring at the clock, listening to the silence of the hotel room. Finally, I grabbed my jacket and set out, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire inside me. The streets were quieter than usual, most tourists settling in for the night. As I approached the small theater where the reading was taking place, my heart rate picked up. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I slipped inside the building, keeping to the shadows as I scanned the crowd. It was a small gathering, no more than 20 or 30 people seated in rows of wooden chairs facing a small stage. At first, I couldn't see her, but then, toward the back, I spotted Brianna. She sat near the corner, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in days. And there, seated next to her, was David. They were talking quietly, leaning in close, their heads nearly touching. Brianna's expression was soft, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips as David whispered something in her ear. My stomach twisted. I'd hoped to be wrong, hoped that my suspicions were unfounded. But seeing them together again, the intimacy between them impossible to ignore, made it all too real. I wasn't sure what I'd expected when I followed Brianna that night. Maybe I thought I'd catch them in a compromising position, some irrefutable proof of her betrayal. But as I stood there in the back of the room, hidden behind a column, watching the way they interacted, I realized I didn't need to see anything more. I already knew. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. Every word exchanged between them, every smile, every casual touch felt like a slap to the face. The room, once filled with the quiet murmur of attendees settling in for the reading, seemed to close in on me. The walls felt too tight, the air too thin. I wanted to march over there, grab David by the collar, and demand answers. But something held me back. A small, bitter voice in the back of my mind told me that confronting them here, in front of everyone, wouldn't give me the satisfaction I craved. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I stood in the shadows, my heart pounding as the reading began. David was the first to take the stage. He walked to the front with an easy confidence, as if he owned the room. I watched Brianna's face light up when he began to speak, her eyes glued to him like he was the only person in the world. I hated it. Hated the way she looked at him, the way she hung on his every word. But I also couldn't tear my eyes away. David's poetry was about love, about passion and desire. His voice was smooth, his words flowing like honey as he painted pictures of stolen moments and whispered secrets. And the more he spoke, the more I realized that he wasn't just reading to the crowd, he was reading to Brianna. His gaze would flicker toward her every few lines, his voice lowering slightly, as if the poem was meant for her and her alone. The rest of the room faded into the background. All I could see was the two of them, their connection palpable. I clenched my jaw, my fists trembling at my sides as I fought the urge to storm out of there. But I couldn't leave, not yet. When the reading finally ended, people began to rise from their seats, applauding politely. I watched as Brianna stood, turning to David with a smile that made my stomach churn. They spoke for a few minutes, their voices too low for me to hear, but the tone was unmistakable. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, back when Brianna and I had first started dating. Back when she used to look at me like that. I waited until they left the building, following at a distance as they made their way down the street. They walked slowly, their shoulders brushing occasionally, their voices blending with the sounds of the night. I trailed behind them, keeping to the shadows, my mind racing. Where were they going? What were they planning? And then they stopped in front of a small cafe, the same one I'd seen them in before. David opened the door for her, and they stepped inside. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger I'd been trying to suppress boiled over, and before I knew it, I was crossing the street, my heart thundering in my chest. I pushed through the door of the cafe, the bell above it ringing sharply as I stepped inside. They didn't see me at first. Brianna was too busy laughing at something David had said, her face bright with a happiness I hadn't seen in months. But then she glanced up, her smile faltering when she saw me standing there, fists clenched at my sides. "Jason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes widened with panic as she realized I'd followed her. David turned around, his face draining of color as he saw me. "Jason, listen. Save it," I growled, my voice thick with anger. "I don't want to hear another word out of your mouth." Brianna stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "It's not what you think." "No?" I snapped, stepping closer, my eyes burning into hers. "Then why don't you tell me what the hell it is?" "Brianna? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear." Brianna's face crumbled as she struggled to find the right words, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse like a lifeline. For a moment, neither of us moved, the tension between us so thick it was almost suffocating. David stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if he was about to say something, but thought better of it. I didn't care what he had to say. He was the last person I wanted to hear from. Brianna stammered, her eyes darting between David and me. "It's not like that, Jason. I can explain." "Explain what?" My voice was louder now, drawing the attention of the other patrons in the cafe. I didn't care. Let them watch. Explain how you've been sneaking off to these literary events to cozy up to this guy. Explain why you've been lying to me for weeks. Her lips trembled, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the woman I used to know, the one I'd fallen in love with. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I wasn't lying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just didn't want to hurt you. Hurt me? I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cold. You didn't want to hurt me, so you spent every night with him? How is that supposed to make any sense? David stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Look, man, this isn't what you think. Brianna and I said shut up, I snarled, cutting him off. My fists itched to lash out, to wipe that smug, apologetic expression off his face, but I held back, barely. You don't get to talk. Brianna's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step closer to me. Jason, please. I never meant for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. It just happened. As if that excused everything, as if that made it okay. I took a step back, shaking my head. I can't believe you. After everything we've been through. This is how it ends? Her tears spilled over, and she reached for me, but I pulled away. I didn't want her touch. Not now. Not after everything. I left the cafe before Brianna could say anything else. The sight of her tear-streaked face was too much to bear. I needed air, needed space. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to soothe the fire raging inside my chest. I walked aimlessly through the narrow streets, the sound of waves crashing against the shore in the distance providing a soundtrack to my spiraling thoughts. The betrayal clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the image of Brianna and David together, their whispers, their laughter. It replayed over and over in my mind, each time cutting deeper. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make this gnawing pain go away, but nothing would come. I was numb. How had we gotten here? We were supposed to be on our honeymoon, starting a new chapter of our lives together, not tearing it apart. I'd trusted her with everything, my heart, my future, and she'd thrown it away for some poet she barely knew. The weight of it all pressed down on me, threatening to crush me with each step I took. I ended up at the beach, the waves lapping gently at the shore, as if mocking the chaos inside me. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow on the water. I sat down on the cold sand, my knees drawn up to my chest, staring out at the endless horizon. For a while, I let myself just be. I didn't think, didn't feel, just existed in the quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic crash of the waves. It was a strange kind of peace, but it was fleeting. The moment I let my mind wander, everything came flooding back. The hurt, the anger, the betrayal. I couldn't stay here forever. As much as I wanted to disappear into the night, I had to face the reality of the situation. Brianna had cheated on me. She hadn't admitted it outright, but the evidence was clear enough. The sneaking around, the way she looked at David, the lies, it all pointed to the same conclusion. But what now? What was I supposed to do? Confront her again? Pack my things and leave? The thought of leaving twisted something in my gut. As much as I hated what she'd done, I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. I needed answers. Real answers. With a deep breath, I stood up, brushing the sand off my jeans. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't just leave things as they were. I had to confront her properly, to hear her side of the story, even if I already knew what it was. As I made my way back to the hotel, my heart pounded with each step. The streets were quiet now, the town settling into its late-night lull. When I reached our room, I hesitated outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to avoid the inevitable conversation that was about to take place. But I couldn't. I had to face this. I pushed open the door. Brianna was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Jason? Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of her emotions. She stood up, taking a tentative step toward me. Stop. I held up a hand, cutting her off. I don't want any more lies. She flinched, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in front of her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. I stared at her, my heart aching. Then why did you do it? She didn't answer right away, her eyes dropping to the floor as she struggled to find the words. Finally, she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was lost. I felt disconnected from you. From us. And David, he made me feel seen. Like I mattered." Her words stung, but I couldn't deny that there was some truth to them. Over the past few months, things between us hadn't been perfect. We'd both been caught up in our own lives, in work, in the stress of planning the wedding. Maybe I hadn't been as present as I should have been. But that didn't make what she'd done okay. "I don't care how disconnected you felt," I said, my voice rising with anger. "You had a choice, Brianna. And you chose him." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry, Jason. I'm so sorry." I stood there, watching her cry, my heart a mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, that we could work through this. But another part of me, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, couldn't bring myself to forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The days that followed felt like a blur of anger, sorrow, and exhaustion. Brianna and I barely spoke after that night. We existed in the same space, but the silence between us was heavy and oppressive. Neither of us knew what to say, and every time we tried to talk, it quickly dissolved into accusations and apologies. I spent most of my time outside the hotel, wandering through the narrow streets or sitting on the beach, staring out at the waves as they crashed against the shore. I kept telling myself that I needed to make a decision, that I needed to figure out what came next. But the truth was, I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I wanted to walk away from everything we'd built or try to salvage the pieces of our broken marriage. One afternoon, after days of avoidance, Brianna suggested we go for a walk along the cliffs. It was something we'd planned to do before everything fell apart, back when this trip still felt like a honeymoon. I hesitated, but part of me wanted to see if being outside, away from the suffocating tension of the hotel, would help us find some clarity. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the wind whipping through the grass and the distant roar of the ocean below. The cliffs were breathtaking, steep, jagged rocks that plunged into the sea, the horizon stretching out endlessly in front of us. But the beauty of the scenery did little to soothe the storm inside me. Eventually, Brianna stopped, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't even know if we can." I stood beside her, my hands stuffed into my pockets. "Neither do I." She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I miss us," she whispered. "I miss how we used to be." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I missed us too. The version of us before the lies, before the betrayal. But that version of us was gone, and I wasn't sure if we could ever get it back. "I miss it too," I admitted, my voice rough. "But I don't know if we can ever go back." She nodded, her face crumpling as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know I ruined everything." For a long time, we just stood there, side by side, staring out at the horizon. The wind whipped around us, carrying the salty scent of the sea, but the weight of what lay between us kept us grounded. I could feel the space widening between us, not just physically but emotionally. We had shared so much over the years. But this felt insurmountable. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the cliffs, I turned to Brianna. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer right away, her eyes still focused on the horizon. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I want to try." Her words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that we could somehow fix this. But the other part of me, the part that had been hurt, betrayed, wasn't so sure. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. "I don't know if trying is enough," I said, my voice cracking. It might be too late. The more I thought about her words, the more I realized that she wasn't the only one who didn't know what came next. I didn't know either. It was strange, standing on the precipice of what felt like the end of everything, and not knowing if I was supposed to fight for it or let it fall apart. The following days blurred together. We fell into a strange routine of avoidance and tentative attempts at conversation. Brianna would sometimes reach out, her voice trembling with sincerity as she apologized for the 100th time, but the wall between us remained impenetrable. One evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself alone at the beach again. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, and the water reflected the colors like a mirror. I watched the waves roll in, each one crashing against the shore before receding back into the ocean. I was lost in thought when I heard footsteps approaching behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Brianna. She sat down beside me in the sand, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out at the water. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt different this time, not as heavy, not as suffocating. It was as if we both knew that something had to give, that we couldn't continue like this forever. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness of the evening. "Maybe we need some time apart." Her words took me by surprise. I turned to look at her, my heart skipping a beat. "You want to leave?" She shook her head, her expression conflicted. "No, I don't want to leave. But I think we need space. Time to figure out what we really want." I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her that we could figure this out together, that we didn't need to be apart. But deep down, I knew she was right. We were stuck in a cycle of hurt and resentment. And maybe time apart was the only way to break it. "Maybe you're right," I said finally, my voice heavy with reluctance. "Maybe we do need some time." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't want this to be the end, Jason. I want to believe that we can find our way back to each other." Her words were sincere, but they felt like a promise neither of us could keep. I wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what had been broken. But trust didn't come easy. And the scars of betrayal ran deep. "I don't know if we can," I admitted, my voice rough. "But I guess we won't know unless we try." And with that, we sat together in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, both of us uncertain of what the future held. A few days after Brianna's suggestion, she packed her bags and left the hotel, taking a flight back home. It wasn't permanent, at least, that's what she told me, but the empty room felt like a confirmation of how far we'd fallen. For the first time since we arrived, I was alone in this seaside town, a place that had once seemed so romantic and full of possibility. Now, every corner, every cafe, every sunset reminded me of what we'd lost. I couldn't stop replaying our last conversation in my head. Her words echoed like a warning bell, loud and persistent. Time apart will help. But would it? Was space going to mend something so deeply broken? I couldn't shake the thought that by leaving, we were already drifting farther apart. And I wondered if either of us would find our way back. For the next few days, I did my best to go through the motions. I wandered the cliffs alone, tried to eat at the small restaurants Brianna and I had once enjoyed, even sat by the beach at night. But without her, everything felt hollow. It was like staring at a life that no longer belonged to me, like trying to fit into a picture I wasn't a part of anymore. As much as I tried to distract myself, David still haunted my thoughts. I knew it wasn't healthy to fixate on him, but I couldn't help it. I'd often wonder if Brianna was thinking about him now that she was back in the city. Did she regret her affair, or did she still long for the connection she felt with him? Was he reaching out to her, knowing she was away from me? These thoughts gnawed at me, fueling my anger and bitterness. One evening, while sitting by the window of the hotel, I found myself scrolling through social media, something I hadn't done in days. There, on David's page, I saw it. A post from the very event where I discovered them. He had posted a poem about betrayal, with an accompanying photo of the seaside venue. The caption read, "To be seen is the most dangerous vulnerability." My blood boiled. He was using their affair, our private destruction, as artistic fuel. He was turning my pain into poetry, and people were praising it. The comments were filled with admiration, people gushing over his raw honesty and courage to express vulnerability. But what about me? What about the people he hurt in the process? I closed the app, my hands trembling. This was it. This was the final straw. I couldn't let him get away with this. He had turned our lives into his art, and I wasn't going to sit by and let him profit from it. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't keep running away from the truth. I needed to confront David, to make him understand that this wasn't some abstract story he could twist into his own narrative. It was my life. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the hotel. The night air was cool, and the town was quiet. I made my way toward the venue where the literary event had taken place. It was a small, intimate space overlooking the water. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the building, knowing I was about to confront the man who had torn my marriage apart. When I arrived at the venue, it was dark and empty. The event was long over, and the once bustling space now felt abandoned. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors, wondering if I should just leave. But the thought of David's smug face, his poetic captions, and the fact that he was still out there living his life as if nothing had happened, pushed me forward. I didn't have his personal address, but I knew where to find him. David had a small studio in town where he often held private readings and workshops. It wasn't far from the venue, just a short walk down a cobblestone street lined with art galleries and cafes. As I approached, I could see the lights on inside the studio, the warm glow spilling out onto the street. Without thinking, I pushed open the door. David was sitting at a small table, surrounded by books and papers. He looked up in surprise when he saw me, his face quickly morphing from confusion to recognition. He stood up, his hands raised slightly in a defensive gesture. "Jason," he said, his voice calm but wary. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. My fists clenched at my sides as I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, threatening to spill over. "You've got a lot of nerve," I said, my voice low and steady, though it took every ounce of self-control to keep it that way. "Posting about what happened, turning my life, my marriage, into one of your little poems." David's expression shifted, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I didn't mean to." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't stand there and pretend like you didn't know exactly what you were doing. You're using her, as inspiration. But this isn't some story you can twist into whatever makes you look good. This is real. You destroyed something real." He took a step back, his hands still raised. "Jason, I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't set out to hurt you." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't set out to hurt me? Do you think that makes it any better? You knew she was married. You knew what you were doing the entire time." He didn't say anything, his eyes dropping to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. For a moment, I almost pitied him. "Almost. You think you're so deep, don't you?" I continued, my voice shaking with anger. "With your poems and your artistic soul. But all you are is a selfish coward." David swallowed hard, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely audible. But his apology meant nothing to me. It was too late for sorry. "Do you know what you've done to her?" I asked, my voice rising. "Do you know what this is doing to us?" He didn't answer, and I took another step toward him. "She's ruined because of you. We're ruined because of you." David opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He just stood there, staring at me with those wide, guilty eyes, and for a moment, I thought about hitting him. I thought about letting all of my anger, all of my pain, explode in one violent release. But then I realized something. It wasn't him I was really angry at. Yes, he was part of it. Yes, he'd played a role in this whole mess. But the real betrayal had come from Brianna. She was the one who had made the choice to cheat, the one who had broken our vows. David was just a symptom of a deeper problem. With a deep breath, I took a step back, unclenching my fists. "You're not worth it," I muttered, turning away from him. I walked out of the studio without another word, leaving David standing there in the dim light. I didn't need to hear any more apologies. I didn't need to hit him to feel better. What I needed now was to figure out what came next. As I walked back to the hotel, the weight of everything began to settle on me. Confronting David hadn't given me the closure I thought it would. It hadn't made the pain go away, and it hadn't changed what Brianna had done. All it had done was remind me of how deeply I'd been hurt and how lost I still felt. When I reached the hotel, I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling as my mind raced. Brianna had left for space, but what did that really mean? Was she using this time to reflect, to figure out if she wanted to save our marriage? Or was she already moving on, finding comfort in the arms of someone else, maybe even David? I didn't have the answers. All I had were questions. Questions that kept me awake at night, questions that haunted me every waking moment. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to decide what I wanted. I couldn't control what Brianna did or didn't do. I couldn't change the past. But I could control my own future. I could decide if I was going to keep holding on to something that was already broken. Or if I was going to let go and move forward. But the thought of letting go terrified me. We had been together for so long, had built a life together, shared so many memories. Letting go of her felt like letting go of a part of myself. But holding on to someone who had betrayed me, who had lied to me, that was a different kind of pain. A pain that I wasn't sure I could endure any longer. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen for a long time. Brianna had texted me a few times since she left, asking how I was, telling me she missed me, but I hadn't responded. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to navigate this strange, painful limbo we were in. Finally, I took a deep breath and dialed her number. She answered after the first ring, her voice soft and hesitant. Jason? For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just listened to her breathing on the other end of the line, wondering if she could feel the weight of what I was about to say. I can't do this anymore, I said finally. My voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep pretending like everything's going to be okay. There was a long pause on her end, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. I know, she said softly. I know, Jason. I've been feeling the same way. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. Maybe it's time we let go. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if she was going to hang up. But then she spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. Maybe you're right. And with those words, it felt like a door had closed, a door that we had been trying to keep open for far too long. Letting go wasn't easy. It hurt like hell. But in that moment, I realized that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. And maybe, just maybe, we both deserved a chance to start over. I didn't think the silence could get any heavier between us, but after that phone call, it became almost unbearable. Brianna hadn't come back to the hotel. And I hadn't asked her to. For days, we didn't speak. The reality of what we'd said, the finality of it, started to sink in. It was one thing to feel the weight of the decision, but it was another to live with it. I stayed in the seaside town for a while longer, unable to bring myself to pack up and leave. There was something about the familiarity of the place, the way the ocean's rhythm seemed to match the turmoil inside me, that kept me anchored. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized I was just delaying the inevitable. I was avoiding the truth, that I had to move on, that the life I had with Brianna was slipping away, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. One afternoon, while walking along the beach, I decided to call my closest friend, Mark. He'd been texting me ever since I found out about the affair, asking how I was doing, if I needed to talk. I'd been avoiding him, not wanting to rehash the details of everything that had happened. But now, I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed some sense of normalcy. Even if it was just for a few minutes. Mark picked up on the first ring. Jason, man, I've been worried about you, he said, his voice full of concern. How are you holding up? I didn't know how to answer that question. I'm still here, I said, kicking at the sand as I walked. That's about all I can say right now. Are you still at the hotel? Yeah, but I think I'm heading home soon. There's nothing left for me here. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Mark trying to find the right words. I know it's hard, but maybe leaving that place is what you need. A clean break. You can't keep sitting in that hotel room, replaying everything over and over. I knew he was right, but the thought of leaving still felt like giving up in some way. Like once I left, I'd be admitting that it was truly over. I just don't know what to do next, I admitted. I feel lost. Mark sighed, and I could hear the sympathy in his voice. Look, man, no one expects you to have all the answers right now. You've been through a lot. But sitting in that pain, staying in that place where everything went wrong, it's not going to help. You've got to start thinking about yourself. What do you want? What did I want? That was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. I had been so focused on Brianna, on what she had done, on how she had hurt me, that I hadn't stopped to consider my own future. Did I want to keep fighting for something that might already be lost? Or did I want to let go, to try and rebuild my life from the ashes of this disaster? I don't know yet, I said finally. But I think you're right. It's time to go home. Good, Mark said, relief evident in his voice. And when you get back, let's grab a drink. You don't have to go through this alone. After we hung up, I stood there on the beach, looking out at the horizon. The waves rolled in, steady and relentless, just like they always had. And in that moment, I realized that life was going to keep moving, no matter what happened with Brianna and me. The world wasn't going to stop because my marriage was falling apart. It was time to stop standing still and start moving forward. That night, I packed my bags and booked a flight home. The next chapter of my life was waiting, and whether I was ready or not, it was time to face it. Flying back to the city felt strange. There was something about the buzzing airport, the crowded plane, and the chatter of strangers that felt disconnected from the heaviness of my reality. It was as if the world was carrying on with its usual routine, unaware of the fact that my life had just been upended. When I landed, I took a deep breath, trying to prepare myself for what lay ahead. I hadn't spoken to Brianna since the phone call where we both acknowledged the need to let go. And I wasn't sure what to expect when I walked back into our apartment. Would she be there? Would it feel like home anymore? As I entered the building and made my way up the stairs, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The apartment was the place where we had shared so many memories, good and bad. It was where we had built a life together, where we had laughed and fought and loved. And now, it felt like a tomb, filled with the remnants of what once was. When I opened the door, I was greeted by silence. Brianna wasn't there, and the apartment was exactly as we had left it. The same framed photos on the walls, the same furniture, the same life frozen in time. But it felt different now. It felt like I was walking through a memory, like the life we had shared here had already faded into the past. I dropped my bags by the door and wandered through the apartment, my fingers trailing along the familiar surfaces. Everything reminded me of her, of us. The coffee mugs we had picked out together. The throw blanket we had argued about buying. The bookshelf filled with novels we had planned to read but never got around to. I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at the bed where we had once slept side by side. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, feeling the weight of the emptiness around me. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry, not just for what Brianna had done, but for what we had lost. For the dreams we had once shared, for the love that had once felt so solid and unbreakable. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, letting the tears fall, but eventually, I wiped my eyes and stood up. I couldn't stay here, surrounded by the ghosts of our past. I needed to move forward, even if it felt impossible. That evening, I texted Mark, asking if he was still up for that drink. He responded almost immediately, telling me to meet him at our usual bar. I grabbed my jacket and left the apartment, relieved to have something, anything, to distract me from the overwhelming sadness that clung to me like a shadow. When I arrived at the bar, Mark was already there, sitting at a small table near the back. He stood up when he saw me, pulling me into a tight hug. "Man, it's good to see you," he said, clapping me on the back. "How are you holding up?" "I'm here," I said with a half smile, sitting down across from him. "That's about all I can say." Mark nodded, his expression understanding. "That's a start. What matters is that you're not stuck in that place anymore. You're back, and we're going to figure this out. We ordered drinks, and for the next few hours, we talked about everything and nothing. Mark didn't push me to talk about Brianna, and I appreciated that. We talked about work, about mutual friends, about anything that didn't involve my broken marriage. It was a welcome distraction, but even as we laughed and joked, the weight of what was happening lingered in the back of my mind. I knew that this was just the beginning of a long, painful process, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get through it. But at least I wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild my life piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under, but I kept moving forward. Brianna and I finally had the conversation we had been avoiding for so long. We met at a small cafe, both of us feeling the awkwardness and tension between us. She looked different, tired, worn down, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. I wondered if I looked the same to her. We sat across from each other, nursing our coffee cups, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for what I did. For the way I hurt you." I nodded, my emotions a complicated mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite define. "I know," I said. "But it's more than that. It's about trust, Brianna. And I don't know if we can ever get that back." She looked down at her cup, tears welling up in her eyes. "I wish I could take it all back," she whispered. "But I can't. And I know you deserve better than what I gave you." We talked for a long time, about the affair, about our marriage, about where we had gone wrong. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. For the first time, we were both honest with each other, brutally honest. And by the end of the conversation, we both knew what had to happen. We had to let go. It wasn't easy. And it didn't happen all at once, but slowly, we began the process of entangling our lives. We filed for divorce, divided our belongings, and made arrangements for the future. It was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. For me, that new chapter was filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. I had been through hell, but I had survived. And now, it was time to start over. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it.